Story 1. The Whispering Walls. The house on Elmwood Drive had been empty for years. Its windows were boarded up, its paint peeled like sunburnt skin, and the yard was a jungle of overgrown weeds. But when Sarah and Mark moved in, they thought they'd found their dream home. It was cheap, spacious, and had good bones, as the realtor had said. What the realtor hadn't mentioned were the whispers. At first, Sarah thought it was the wind. The house creaked and groaned like an old man settling into a chair, and the sound of the trees brushing against the windows was constant. But then she started hearing it, soft, indistinct murmurs, like someone speaking just out of earshot. She'd be washing dishes in the kitchen, and the whispers would rise from the walls, faint but insistent. She'd turn around, expecting to see Mark, but the room would be empty. "Do you hear that?" she asked Mark one night as they lay in bed. "Hear what?" he mumbled, half asleep. "The whispering. It's coming from the walls." Mark sighed and rolled over. "It's just the house settling, or the pipes. Old houses make noise." But Sarah knew it wasn't the pipes. The whispers had a rhythm, a cadence, like a conversation. She began to spend her days alone in the house, following the sound from room to room, pressing her ear against the walls. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, but she could never quite make out the words. It was maddening. One afternoon, while Mark was at work, Sarah decided to investigate the basement. The realtor had told them the previous owners had left some old furniture down there, but Sarah and Mark hadn't bothered to check it out yet. The basement door was heavy and stuck, but after a few tugs, it creaked open. The air that rushed up was cold and damp, carrying with it the faint smell of mildew and something else, something metallic. Sarah flicked on the light switch, but the bulb flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the room. The basement was cluttered with boxes, old furniture, and tools. But in the far corner, she saw something that made her blood run cold. There was a door, a small, narrow door, like the kind that led to a crawl space. It was slightly ajar, and from it, the whispers were emanating. Her heart pounded as she approached the door. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, and she could almost make out the words now. They were calling her name. "Sarah? Sarah." She knelt down and peered into the darkness beyond the door. The crawl space was small, barely large enough for a person to fit through, and it was filled with cobwebs and dust. But at the far end, she saw something glinting in the dim light. It was a small, metal box. She reached in and pulled it out, her hands trembling. The box was cold to the touch, and when she opened it, she found a stack of old photographs. They were black and white, faded with age, and they showed a family, a man, a woman, and 2 children. But there was something wrong with the pictures. The faces were blurred, distorted, as if they had been smeared with grease. As she flipped through the photos, the whispers grew louder, more frantic. She could hear them clearly now, and they weren't just calling her name. They were telling her to leave, to get out of the house before it was too late. Suddenly, the light bulb flickered and went out, plunging the basement into darkness. Sarah dropped the box and scrambled to her feet, her heart racing. She could hear something moving in the crawl space, something scraping against the floor. She turned and ran for the stairs, but the door slammed shut behind her, trapping her in the basement. The whispers were deafening now, filling her ears, her mind. She could feel them crawling over her skin, like insects. She screamed, pounding on the door, but no one came. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whispers stopped. The door creaked open, and Sarah stumbled out, gasping for air. She ran upstairs and called Mark, but he didn't answer. She packed a bag and left the house, vowing never to return. But that night, as she lay in a motel room, she heard it again, the whispers. They were faint, but they were there, coming from the walls. And this time she could make out the words. "We're still here." Story 2. The Man in the Mirror. Tom had always hated mirrors. Even as a child, he'd avoided them, convinced that if he looked too long, he'd see something staring back at him that wasn't his reflection. His parents had laughed it off as a phase, but the fear had never gone away. Now, at 35, he still avoided mirrors whenever possible. But when he moved into his new apartment, he couldn't avoid the one in the bathroom. It was large, taking up most of the wall above the sink, and it had an old tarnished frame that gave it an eerie, antique look. The first time Tom saw it, he felt a chill run down his spine. There was something about the way it reflected the light, something almost alive. The first few nights were uneventful. Tom avoided looking at the mirror as much as possible, keeping his eyes down when he brushed his teeth or washed his face. But on the fourth night, something strange happened. He was standing at the sink, splashing water on his face, when he heard a noise behind him. It was a soft, shuffling sound, like someone moving quietly across the floor. He froze, his heart pounding, and slowly raised his head to look in the mirror. At first, he saw only his own reflection, pale and wide-eyed. But then, in the corner of the mirror, he saw something else, a shadowy figure standing just behind him. He spun around, but the bathroom was empty. He told himself it was just his imagination, a trick of the light. But the next night, it happened again. This time, the figure was closer, its features more distinct. It was a man, tall and thin, with hollow eyes and a mouth that seemed to stretch too wide. Tom could see him clearly in the mirror, standing right behind him, but when he turned around, there was no one there. Over the next few days, the man in the mirror became a constant presence. He would appear at random times, sometimes just standing there, watching, other times moving closer, his mouth opening as if to speak. Tom tried to cover the mirror with a towel, but it always fell off. He tried to avoid the bathroom altogether, but that was impossible. One night, after a particularly bad episode, Tom decided to confront the man in the mirror. He stood in front of the sink, staring at his own reflection, and waited. It didn't take long for the man to appear. This time, he was so close that Tom could see the details of his face, the deep lines, the yellowed teeth, the eyes that seemed to burn with a cold, malevolent light. "What do you want?" Tom demanded, his voice shaking. The man in the mirror smiled, a slow, cruel smile that sent a shiver down Tom's spine. And then, for the first time, he spoke. "I want out," he said, his voice a low, guttural growl. Before Tom could react, the man reached out, not through the mirror, but from it. His hand, cold and bony, gripped Tom's wrist, pulling him forward. Tom struggled, but the man was impossibly strong. He felt himself being dragged into the mirror, the world around him twisting and distorting. When he opened his eyes, he was in a dark, featureless void. The man in the mirror stood before him, still smiling. "Thank you," he said. "I've been waiting a long time for this." Tom tried to scream, but no sound came out. He watched in horror as the man stepped through the mirror and into the bathroom, taking his place in the real world. And then, the void closed in around him, and he was alone. Story 3. The Shadow in the Field. Emily had always loved the countryside, the rolling hills, the endless fields, the quiet. It was a welcome escape from the noise and chaos of the city. But when she moved into the old farmhouse on the edge of town, she quickly realized that the countryside had its own kind of darkness. The first night, she heard the dogs. They were far off, their howls carried on the wind, but there was something unnatural about the sound. It wasn't the mournful howl of a lonely dog. It was something deeper, more primal, like the sound of a predator closing in on its prey. The next morning, she asked her neighbor, an elderly man named Mr. Grayson, about the dogs. "Dogs?" he said, his brow furrowing. "Ain't no dogs around here, not for miles." Emily tried to put it out of her mind, but the howling continued every night, growing louder and closer. She began to feel like she was being watched, even when she was alone in the house. She'd catch movement out of the corner of her eye, but when she turned, there was nothing there. One night, unable to sleep, she decided to take a walk. The moon was full, casting a pale light over the fields, and the air was cool and crisp. She walked along the edge of the field, the tall grass brushing against her legs, and tried to clear her mind. But then she saw it, a shadow moving across the field. It was large, much larger than a dog, and it moved with a strange, almost human gait. Emily froze, her heart pounding as the shadow stopped and turned toward her. She could see its eyes glowing like embers in the darkness. It stared at her for a long moment, and then it began to move toward her, slowly at first, then faster. Emily turned and ran, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She could hear the thing behind her, its footsteps heavy and deliberate. She didn't dare look back, but she could feel it getting closer, its breath hot on her neck. She reached the house and slammed the door shut, locking it behind her. She leaned against the door, her chest heaving, and listened. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. And then, from the other side of the door, she heard a low, guttural growl. Emily didn't sleep that night. She sat in the living room clutching a knife and waited for the thing to break in. But it never did. When the sun rose, she cautiously opened the door and looked out. There was nothing there, no sign of the shadow or the creature it belonged to. But that night, the howling started again, and this time it was right outside her window.